Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 83. When did that happen? And today we're going to talk about why top players win more. And this is specifically focused on the Lord of the Rings set and the data from that set. But before we go in there, I would like to thank my sponsors, mtgazone.com, who are kind enough to sponsor the stream podcast and the YouTube channel. And also give me a nice space to write up some of the thoughts that I have about data on their website. So if you're interested in reading those things with some very useful graphs, I try to always make at least a couple of articles every format that are universal. So you can go back to those, how to wheel, how to read signals, all that kind of stuff. And this podcast is also sponsored by you via the Patreon. And I'm happy to announce a new patron in Sam. So thank you, Sam, for being the newest patron. And with that, you get a couple of perks. You get access to the slides. You get possibility of asking question of the week. You get possibilities of asking for a deep dive on the card. Depends on the tier. So you can go to my Patreon again, Sherkovitz, and check that out. If you have some spare cash lying around, I'm quite happy to take it. And before we move to the main topic, I always start with a preamble that allows me to warm up. Streaming be hard, going straight from not talking and being in Excel for like 2 hours before the show into talking about it is a hard transition. So I try to make this warm myself up. Pro tip if you are interested in content creation. And today, the preamble is that there is a big difference between forcing and preference. And actually, because I'm that kind of a content creator, I highly recommend you the Art of Draft podcast from Ham TV and Just Lola Man. They had a whole episode on talking about the difference between forcing and preference. It's very interesting to see those majestic, limited brains talking about this topic. But there is this stigma. Oh, hi, Ham, in the chat. There's a big stigma about forcing that, I don't know, comes maybe from people who were raised on the Ben Stark's drafting the hard way article. And there is a lot of people who are thinking, oh, well, if I go into the draft thinking, I want to draft red, that's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing if red is the best color. You don't have to draft red, but if the opportunity presents itself, you should be ready for that because this is the best color. So you should be assertive. And actually, when you look at the data that we're going to look today between the top players and the lower tier players on 17 lands, one of the big things that strikes me there is the perseverance of the top players to try to stay in the two best colors in this format. Because this format is clearly color unbalanced. That doesn't mean it's bad, because balance or lack of it is not necessarily good. And I think that the bigger problems than color imbalance in this format are slightly different. For example, lack of super powerful bombs, and I might be talking about it during the later slides. But if the colors are not balanced, you definitely want to end up on the good ones. And you only end up on the good ones if you have a high preference for those, because they are so deep that you can get a decent deck, even if there are several people on your pod drafting them. And the worst thing you can do is to try, half-heartedly to draft good colors and then basically give up at a certain point and switch to the bad colors, because then you have the worst of two worlds of being in the worst colors, but at the same time not having too many cards in them because you already sacrificed some high picks to get the cards from the good colors. And yeah, we're not going to focus exactly on how to do it. I think that this is a topic for an episode when we have all the gameplay data. And right now, I'm only basing everything on the data that is available via 17lands.com, the official website. But it's worth keeping in mind that just don't get pushed off the top colors if you think that you can get the deck, and try to be more assertive and try to assert your dominance on the table rather than being pushed out. And of course, it will not work every single time, but as we will see in the data, the top players do it, and they do it because also they evaluate cards very well. And this is the thing that you can easily learn. Like, gameplay is difficult, and gameplay requires years and years of practice, playing, discussing with other people, showing your plays to others, and then figuring out what went wrong, what went right. But card evaluation, especially with 17 lands, can be learned relatively quickly. This is the sort of it should, at least in theory, the data from 17 lands should level the playing field between people who play draft occasionally and people who grind draft every single day, because normally it took weeks of playing the format for people to figure out which cards are good. You can make shortcuts and just figure them out from 17 lands, and if you apply that knowledge correctly, which is basically the whole topic of every single episode that I'm making, is how to apply the knowledge of the data that you have correctly and not fall into traps of, I don't know, confirming what you want to be true, or overstating certain things, or lacking subtlety in looking at numbers. Then you should have actually a big boost, because you don't have to play 5 drafts a day. You can play 2 drafts a week, and still with a bit of involvement in the data, you can still know almost as much as people that play dozens of drafts every week. All right. And with that done, we can move to the patron question of the week, which comes from Mercurio this time. And they are asking, is there a way to link number of lands with a win rate to find the optimum? This is a very hard question, and I think I'm slowly approaching an full episode on that, because I think that this format is a very good format to try to answer that question, because we have several things. One, we have Tempted by the Ring mechanic, which allows you to, if you reach level 2 of it, allows you to loot every turn that you attack with your ring bearer. And this is an amazing smoothing mechanic. So you basically can get to a number of lands that you want to have on the board, and then every single extra land you can loot away and get a different card. So that's one thing. Then the second thing that there's in the format is the landcyclers, and the landcyclers are costing only 1 mana, which is actually quite cheap, especially that in this format there are not so many good 1-drops. Because there are no good 1-drops, you can sacrifice turn number 1 to cycle a land, and because of that you can potentially play decks that have 15 lands and a couple of landcyclers, maybe 2-3, and that sort of virtually makes your land count to 17 or even 18. And actually, there is this conflict between looting that you get from the ring, because you want to loot away land, and having the land cyclers in your deck, because if you have land cyclers, you cannot cycle lands because you have the land cycler. So instead of cycling a land that you don't need anymore, you have a 6 mana casting cost creature, and that is a conflict, and it brings tensions into the deck. So it's going to be a great episode to try to look at the interface of those when we have the full data with which cards are in the deck, and how many land cyclers are in the deck, and how many lands, and how they did come together, and what were the results, especially when you have those large sample sizes. But before we go into that, because we don't have the data for that, we can answer several things, and that might direct you into the ways of thinking about it. I'm not giving too many prescriptions on the data set, but I'm going to give you some information, and use this information as you please. I'm going to interpret the data and show you how I understand partially those interpretations. But obviously these things need to be tested, and the more you test, the more I'll have diverse data, and the more diverse data I have, well, the more likely that I will come with some decent conclusions when I actually look at the data set. So first of all, to look at it, you need to look at how does the hand smoother work, because most of us play best of 1, and best of 1 is very different from normal Magic on paper. You have very different distribution of lands that you draw in your opening hand. And I got this 960,000 opening hands from 17 lands. This is for previous formats, so this is March of the Machine. And based on those things, I could calculate how many lands in your opening hand do you have on average. I did it before for other formats, and nothing changed since then. It's basically because of the hand smoother and how it operates, you basically get either 2, 3, or 4 lands in your opening hand. And depending on how many lands you put in your deck, between 15, 16, 17, and 18, because these are the numbers that have large enough sample sizes that I can convincingly measure it, not much changes into how many free land hands do you have. It's roughly around 55%, independently if you have 15 lands or 18 lands. What changes is how many two land hands do you have, and it changes, well, roughly linearly with an increase of the land count. So you start, like, if you have 15 lands, 40% of your hands will be two landers. If you have 16 lands, 30%. If you have 17 lands, that will be 23%. And if you have 18 lands, only 16% of your hands will be two landers. And then that difference is reflected in how many four land hands will you have. So it's 7% when you have 15 lands, 12% when you have 16, 20% when you have 17, and 28% when you have 18 lands. So this is basically, when you decide to put 16 lands, that's what you decide. You decide that I want to have more two land hands and fewer four land hands, and that's going to happen when you put 16 lands in your hand. And importantly, you have almost no zero land hands. In the 1 million samples, I found roughly 16 no land hands. So they happen quite rarely. And then you have very few six land hands that also happened maybe like not even 10 times in the whole data set. And, if you go really low with lands, you will get those one landers. So if you have 15 land decks, it will be 2.5% of your games will have a one land hand. And if you have 17, that will be once every 200 games, you will have a one lander. So not everyone plays enough draft to see one lander hand in the format, but they will happen. And the same with five landers, they happen like 0.4% when you have 17 lands, and almost never when you have 15. So that's one thing that you get. But when you put the land cyclers, they are not counted as lands, so they are not a part of the hand smoothing system. And what it basically means is that you have a hybrid kind of deck where part of your lands are smoothed and part of your lands are not smoothed. What does it mean is that the more land cyclers you put in instead of the lands, the more your distribution of lands in your hand will look like in a best of three. If you would have, I know it's theoretically impossible, but if you would have only land cyclers, I know you don't have lands then, but that would mean that you basically maybe there would be something else. Maybe there would be like spell lands that count as spells and not as lands, and they are lands on the other side, but the smoother doesn't see it. If you put only those spell lands in your deck, then you basically will have the same as in best of three, but you will be playing best of one. And of course, the smoother in best of one is there for a reason. It's there to ensure that you are not going to be completely ruined in this one game that you have against the opponent by drawing a zero lander and then another one lander and you mulligan to 5. So this is the risk of putting those land cyclers. And what does it have as an impact on the distribution of those hands is, first of all, you see fewer of the hands that have 3 lands. If you have 17 lands, it's 56%. If you have 18 lands, it's 55%. If you put 15 lands and 2 land cyclers, you will have 48% of the hands when you have 3 lands or land cyclers in your opening hand. And if you have 3 land cyclers, it will be 46%. So it's like 8 percentage points lower. Where does this difference disappear? Well, first of all, if you have 15 plus 2, so technically similar as 17 lands, you will have more 2-land hands. It's 23% when you have 17 lands, and it's 27.5% when you have 15 lands and 2 land cyclers. If you have 15 lands and 3 land cyclers, you will have more of those 4-land hands. So you have you have 20% of those, and when you have 17 lands, you have 26% of those when you have 15 lands and 3 land cyclers. And what you will really see as an increase is the number of hands with 5 lands or land cyclers. This almost never happens when you have 17 lands, 0.4%. Rarely happens when you have 18 lands. It happens only in 0.7% of cases. But if you have 15 lands and 3 land cyclers, 5% of your hands will be those 5 land hands. And 2.6% when you have 15 lands and 2 land cyclers. And there will also be an increase of how often you get those 1 land hands. It will happen roughly 1.4% versus 0.5%. And that has something to do with the fact that 2.5% of your opening hands when you have 15 lands are going to be one landers. So that's much higher than when you have 17 lands. And 1.4 because 1.1 percentage points of that disappears because you will draw 1 land, but you will also draw a land cycler, which will be your sort of second land in that situation. D-Take is asking a question: do MDFC lands count as lands for the shuffler? It's not relevant here, but curious. According to the data analysis that we did during the time of Zendikar Rising, they don't count as lands, they count as spells. And that might be relevant for people that play Constructed and play some sort of MDFCs in their deck. And that, of course, exception for that were pathways, which are lands on both sides. So, yeah. Urbivore says smaller increase for 1 land hands than for 5 land hands, though. Right. Because the increase in 1 land hands is related to the fact that when you have 15 lands, you will have more hands that have 1 land. And that's actually decreased from what you would have normally with 15 because of the land cyclers. While this increase is that because this happens when you have 3 lands and 2 land cyclers, or 4 lands, which is a relatively common scenario, and you draw a land cycler on top of that. So yeah, that's what's happening there. So just to give you an impression of that, when you have 15 lands and 2 land cyclers, 32% of your starting hands will have at least 1 land cycler. And when you have 3 land cyclers, that means 45% of your opening hands will have a land cycler in it. So it's not something that happens rarely. It will be relatively frequent because the same hand smoother that smooths your hands also makes sure that you have a slightly higher chance to draw the spell weirdly in your hand, because you will only have this very truncated distribution of how many lands you draw because of the hand smoother. And because of that, you will have those high numbers of how often you get the land cycler, at least 1 land cycler in your hand. And the important part to know is that you will get land cyclers in the hands where you already have multiple lands. Like you see that you 1 landers, you will never get 1 landers with land cyclers because you get so few 0 land hands. And you would have to draw a 0 land hand, and Smoother doesn't allow for that. So you will never happen that you have like the only thing in your hand is the land cycler, which, might happen if you play best of 3. It's only like very small fraction of 2 lander hands that you got 1 land and a land cycler. Again, this is because you will get so few hands that have only 1 land. And then you will frequently have 3 land hands where you have 2 lands and a land cycler, or 1 land and 2 land cyclers. That's going to be a rare scenario. But when you look at the 4 land hands, majority of those will contain at least 1 land cycler, and almost all of the 5 land hands will get a land cycler. Yeah, but that's the whole point. So Funderwunk is making the question. I think that those stats are a little confusing, because if you have 4 lands and 2 land cyclers, those are essentially spells and not lands at that point. Yes, that's exactly the whole point. So you will draw land cyclers disproportionately in the hands where you already have lands. Yes, that's the whole case. Those percentages on the screen are the same percentages that you see here, the distribution of the hands, only I split each of those bars into how many of those hands are only lands and how many of those hands are lands and a land cycler. So if you have 54.8% of the hands when you have 18. Oh, sorry, maybe 18 lands is a bad example. 48% of the hands that have 3 lands or land cyclers when you have 15 lands and 2 land cyclers. You split that 48.1 into 34.2 and 13.8 plus whatever, rounding up, and you add them up, and that's exactly your 48.1. So you can see that within those 48%, roughly quarter is hands that have a land cycler. Yeah, each of those bars chopped into pieces, exactly, that's what it is. So yeah, I mean, the 5 land hands will essentially only be the hands that have a land cycler. And it's good because those land cyclers are expensive. So if you have already 4 lands and you have a land cycler, you don't need to use it. But in some rare situations, when you get like 3 lands and a land cycle, 2 lands and a land cycler, then you might want to use the land cycler. And because of that distribution, you sort of will have that land cycling creature or spell as a useful spell half of the time, and as a necessity cycling the other half of the time. And I think that this is the optimal kind of situation, because you don't want to have most of those creatures as a spell in your deck, because they are not that great spells. If I want more from my 6 drops than just being, those like, Oliphant. So I wouldn't put them in my deck if they did not have that land cycling most of the time. At least I hope I wouldn't have to. But if they are 50% a land and 50% a creature, I love them, because that means that I can have increased spell density in my deck. But at the same time, I'm not gambling completely on not drawing my lands, because they have that emergency kind of bailout option. When I draw, especially the situation when I draw 2 lands and the land cycler, for me, it's almost a default heuristic that I'm going to cycle that thing on the first turn, and then I have my 3 land hand. But if I draw 3 lands and the land cycler, then I probably am going to think about keeping it, unless I'm color screwed or something. So obviously apply caution. And it's the same graph looking at 15 plus 3, and you see it's even a stronger distribution. So if you have 3 land cyclers, like a lot of the time you will have several of those, and often you will have a situation when you have like when you look at this here, you have 21% of your hands will be hands with 4 lands/land cyclers in your opening hand, and some part of it is going to be 2 lands and 2 land cyclers, when you can basically cycle the first land cycler, the one that maybe gives you the right mana, and then keep the other one for casting it later. And by that, you basically do exactly what I said before, this 50-50 split, when half of the times they are land, half of the times they are spells. And of course, I don't have exact maths on what that ratio should be to be the most useful, and maybe that ratio varies between different land cyclers. And obviously my cat came and starts attacking me on the side, as he usually does. I don't know why. Only when I stream. Never does it when I do anything else. Only when I stream, just comes and starts biting me in the elbow, which is great. That he's still so lively at his ancient 14 years old age. But yeah, long story short, putting those land cyclers is beneficial, but I think it's not beneficial in every single deck that you have. But it will be particularly beneficial in one type of deck. So not every deck will be good to play 15 lands and 2 land cyclers, because one of the things, and I showed that in the previous graph, is that you have those more hands when you have 2 lands or land cyclers in your opening hand. And not every deck likes to start their opening hand with 2 lands, because it creates a risk for you to be stuck on those 2 lands, because of course after the opening hand no smoothing applies. You will just draw random cards. You might draw 3 or 4 spells in a row, and then you're in a pickle. So that's the risk that you're taking by putting those land cyclers instead of lands. But I think it is potentially good in decks with a U-shaped mana curve. And U-shaped mana curve means that you are really heavy on the 2 drops. You don't have that much of the middle ground, especially like not many 4 drops. And then you have like a big top end of 6 mana cards at the top end. And this is good for this deck in one particular situation, because decks with cyclers naturally will have a lot of 6-drop, because the cyclers are 6-drops already, and then when you can top them up with some other like expensive powerful creatures, because obviously you will have more hands when you get those 5 lands. So even if you have to cycle your land cycler, even still then to get into 6 mana, but you drop Shelob as a reward, that's probably a decent thing. And you can play this kind of game plan when you have 2 drops everywhere. You go aggressively, but the problem with the aggressive decks is that they run out of steam sometimes, and that's where those 6 drops come into play. You basically run out of steam a bit, and then you play Oliphant, and all of a sudden you have new attacks because you got a bit of flood in your deck. But you won't get too much flood because you only play 15 lands and 2 land cyclers. But on the other hand, playing this 15 plus 2 land cycler strategy might not be that great when you have a bunch of 4 drops, because in this situation you might be stuck on 2 lands for a bit too long, and then your relevant spells cannot be cast, and then you run into world of trouble. So I would say that apply it in the decks that, independently if it's a perfect U-shaped curve or maybe just a 2-drop heavy curve, I think I would want to have like a bunch of my 2-drops to make sure that this strategy works, because this is your insurance policy against those games when you're stuck on 2 lands, which will happen. Right, that covers the patron question of the week. I hope, Mercurio, that you got a question worth out of this answer. And we can move to the main topic. But before I move to the main topic, I wanted just to have a brief look at the evolution of the metagame. I compared the archetype win rate and play frequency across the first few days before I did my last episode. So I did it on Thursday, and the set was released on Tuesday. So we had like 2 days of data in that time. And as you can see, in terms of the frequency of play, at 17 lands users at least level, there was an increase in Rakdos. So Rakdos was a dominant archetype in the first few days, 22% of the games played. Now it's 26.4 within that second week. And there's not much change in Demir. There's zero change in Orzhov. It's 13.6% as it was. Demir increased from 11 to 11.8. That can be easily attributed to variance. Izzet increased to 13.1% from 12.6. Again, easily attributable to variance. Not much change also in Boros, 11.2 to 11.4. And we see drops in those lower win rate archetypes. Azorius dropped by 0.7%, Gruul dropped by 0.5%, Selesnya dropped by like 1.8 percentage points, and Simic dropped by almost 2 percentage points, and Golgari dropped by 0.6. So clearly, the 17 lands user decided, look, this is a Mardu/Grixis format. We're just going to ramp up our drafting of those Mardu-Grixis colors, and we're going to ignore everything else. And to some extent, they did. Drops are not massive, but you know, at least it's something. Something is there. In terms of the win rates, Rakdos, despite being drafted more and being more contested, is still top archetype. It dropped from 60.4 to 59.7. That's not a big drop at all. So despite being drafted at such high frequency, it's still the thing to beat. And yeah, I think that's going to stay until the end of the format, that Rakdos is the best archetype, and it's going to be best by quite a lot. Yeah, it's plus minus 2% in terms of win rate, I think. So, but I think that most of the time those things are even smaller differences. It's just, I think, confidence levels. If you count stats, probably you'll go plus minus 1. That would be the sort of range. That's the question from the chat about what is the degree of variance here. And And also Orzhov dropped by roughly 1.6, 1.4 percentage points. Boros dropped by 1 percentage point, and Golgari dropped by 1 percentage point. Oh, and Gruul dropped by 1 percentage point despite being drafted less. So I guess that other decks become more streamlined, and Gruul didn't. But for much of it, it stayed relatively stable. There's no difference in Izzet was winning 56%, is winning 56%. No much change in Demir, was 55.5, is 55.5. Azorius stayed the same, bad, 51.7, is 51.7. There was a slight increase in Selesnya win rate from 51.1 to 52%. Which is still not impressive, but at least it overtook Azorius at the margin that is definitely not significant. And Simic is still last, even though it increased by 0.8 percentage points. So actually, I put this graph not because it's super interesting because there was so much change. I think it's pretty interesting because there was so little change in those last week. You would think that once people start figuring out proper decks, there will be a big change in the win rates, but there is not. Again, this is all best of one data. Right. And in terms of cards that gained or lost within the first week, the card that increased its game in hand win rate by the most is Dreadful as the Storm. That's the 3-mana combat trick. That changes the base power and toughness of a creature to 5/5, and then you get tempted by the ring. This one increased by 3.8 percentage points, so definitely people figured out how to do something with that particular card. I don't know exactly what, because I don't think I ever played it so far, but it's worth noting that this card is a mover up. Couple of other cards increased, but these are cards that are usually bad. Actually, Dreadful as the Storm, after that increase, has a solid middle kind of the way game in hand win rate. Other cards that improved: the Galadrim Bow, Galadrim Guide, Nimrodal Watcher. That's the 2/1 that gets +1/+0 when you scry. All those cards improved, but they were just very bad. Nimrodal Watcher is Shire Scarecrow increased the 0/3 that can fix your mana. I think that part of it is that those multicolor decks became slightly better in week 2 because people realized which legends to use and which legends to skip. It's still not great, but I mean, it improved. Hit Lane Knots, that's one card that definitely improved and jumped into average card kind of tier. That got boosted by 2.1. Another 2 cards that are like potentially good in 5-color, 4-color archetypes: Inherited Envelope, that's the mana rock that the ring tempts you, and Wizard's Rockets, that's the one that you sack to get mana in any color combination. These both also increased by 2.1 percentage points. And then you have like Knights of Dol Amroth and Gimli's Axe, again, mediocre cards. So really, the interesting part of that graph is Dreadful as a Storm, which increased by almost 4 percentage points. That's quite a lot. So it would be worth watching where are they played. I saw in the chat that it's good in Demir. Hithlane Knots, that card is a decent card and should be treated as such, especially in the spell kind of control decks. And then a bunch of 5-mana fixing increased in win rate. So maybe people are on the cusp of figuring out how to make those multicolor decks. In terms of the decrease of the win rate, there's always a card that, like, for the couple of early days, is being moderately hyped, and I think that Fire of Orthanc. I saw some content creation that was raving about playing multiple Fires of Orthanc. That's the land or artifact destruction, and also a falter effect that non-flying creatures cannot block. That thing had a decent 55% game in hand win rate in the first couple of days, and that dropped to 50%, which you may think that 50% is a good win rate, but it's not on 17 lands when the average user has a 56% win rate. So that definitely dropped off. Other cards that dropped off, Mordor Trebuchet that dropped even further, and I think that right now is like in competition for the worst black common. And I know that some people love playing it. So yeah, take on board the fact that the win rate of that card is at least not good. I assume that there are some good homes, but again, I think that people probably slightly too often think that their thing is a perfect home for it. Mirror Guardian, that was a surprising top green common for the first days. It dropped slightly, but it's still in the decent range. The 4/2 that dies into ring tempting. Then there's Morgul Knife Wound, the aura, black aura that you put on a creature, and then it basically gets -3/-0, and it pings the owner for 2 every turn unless they exile it. And that would have really high win rate in the first couple of days, and now it dropped, and it's sort of medium, especially that it's in black, which is the best color, so it's back to where it's supposed to be. It's still probably the better version of that effect that we've seen in recent years, but the better is still not good enough, because it gives opponent the choice of sacrificing a creature when the damage will be relevant, and choice not to sacrifices if the benefits of having that creature outweighs the drawbacks. What else? Dunedain Blade dropped off. Mirkwood Bats, that's another combo with the Mordor Trebuchet that people are keen on, and those cards potentially the drop in the win rate is because some of the top players decided never to play that thing again when in the first days where they were testing it, and some people stayed playing it that didn't have such a high win rate. That might explain why those two cards dropped more or less the same by 2 percentage points. Other cards, Rush the Room. I don't know if it had any win rate already, but apparently it did, and now it has even a lower one. Snarling Warg does the 3/4 menace. That is a 4/4 when you have an army or orc, whatever. One of the two conditions. I don't want to memorize every single condition when they are so close but different. Nasty End, the sacrifice thing that draws you 2 cards or 3 if it was a legend. That also dropped by 1.7 percentage points. And Surrounded by Orcs, another card that is a big underperformer. And I think that top players did realize that this card is sort of meh. 4 mana for amassing 3 and milling some cards is just not good enough on rate. Boom, boom, boom. Right. So now we can move to the actual topic with just 40 minutes in or so. Which cards are valued high by the top players? And how I calculate those things is 2 ways. One, this is the pick preference. So when you see the card, what percent of the time do you pick it? And we're going to look at the differences between the top and the bottom and the middle tier players on how they have this pick preference. So there will be some cards that top players just see them and take them, and maybe the players from the bottom tier don't. And there will be some cards that players from the top tier very rarely pick, but people in the bottom tier of 17 lands pick it more frequently. I mean, what those tiers mean, it's basically they look at the win rate of the players from the last 3 sets. So if you have win rate of roughly 60% in the 2 of the last 3 sets, you're going to be in the top player echelon. The average win rate of the players from the bottom echelon is around 50%. So they are, I guess that the bottom tier on 17 lands is a good proxy for an average arena user. And the middle players have roughly 55% win rate or so. But when you pick a card, it doesn't mean that you put it in your deck. So the second thing I'm looking at is on-play preference. So what percentage of the time when a player picked a card do they put it in their deck? That required a lot of mathematics because I need to calculate how many games do people play on average with a card depending on its win rate, because of course it will very much differ. So to compare them, I need to calculate the basically prediction of how many games will you play with card X when it's in your deck based on its games played win rate. That was fun. So yeah, we're going to be looking at this top, middle, and bottom 17lands.com tiers of the players. And we're going to look which cards are picked more or less aggressively and why, what is the difference in win rates of those cards, and maybe at the end I'm going to look at which cards do top players have disproportionately more success with than the bottom players. So we're going to look at the cards where the difference between the win rate, top players and bottom players, are the biggest and smallest for some cards, to maybe speculate on why. So first things first, the pick preference. And here is the difference between the pick rate between the top and the bottom players. They are all positive values, which means that these are the cards that the top players pick more by percentage points. So Foray of Orcs is 23 percentage points more picked by the top players than the bottom players. Now, I don't give the numbers, but that can mean that either bottom players pick it 0% of the time and top players pick it 23% of the time, or it can mean that bottom players pick it 77% of the time and top players pick it 100% of the time, and of course everything in between goes. We're not going to look at those absolute values because that would maybe muddle this slide a bit. But I mean, you can sort of guess that Horn of Gondor is going to be highly picked. It's much highly picked by the top players. And when we look at the list of the cards, the first three, around 23 to 20% points higher picked by the top players. Foray of Orcs, Fear Fire Foes, Eomer of the Riddermark, three quality red uncommons. And yeah, I think that top players quickly noticed the data and understood from the gameplay patterns that these are really strong uncommons, especially Fear Fire Foes and Eomer of the Riddermark. Foray of Orcs is slightly weaker, still a very good card. Now, of course, this means that they will be disproportionately played by the top players, which means that the stats of those cards are also slightly boosted by the fact that top players play it more, not only because the card is good. And this is one thing that you maybe have to think about when you look at the game and hand win rate, that not all cards are played equally by all groups of players, and that will exacerbate the differences. So Foray of Orcs, I'm sure, is good, but its win rate is boosted by the fact that top players play it way more than the bottom players do. So probably if you would normalize for that and you wanted to try to find what is the win rate of this card when you take all the arena users into account, Foray of Orcs would be slightly lower than it is in 17 lands users, because those top players are boosting it. And if you want to evaluate the card power in vacuum, again, it will be slightly elevated because it's disproportionately played by the top players. Then we have Horn of Gondor. This is one of the, ironically, cards that the bottom tier players have the highest win rate with. But I think that in this case, it's a sort of like a trap of maybe bottom tier players who I would guess are most of the time more beginner players that are still learning how to draft, and their win rate is going to be better because they already did the first important step of using 17 lands. But of course, getting better takes time. And for them, when they read the Horn of Gondor, they think, you know what, this looks like a white-red card because you need humans. And maybe the top tier level player will look at it and say, you know what, I have like 4 red humans in my black red deck, and I have the 2/1 that dies into an army that's also a human, and the card is busted when it's going to be given a couple of turns to operate. So I'm going to jam it in my black red deck. And because of that, they will pick it more frequently because they don't treat it as a multicolor card. They treat it as a colorless card that, of course, will be better if you have some humans. So, maybe don't play it when you have 0 humans, but when you have some, at least, you can jam it in your deck, and it's still good. Oh yeah, and especially with Rally the Hornburg being the best red commons, that definitely helps. Especially that you can attack with them the same turn as they enter if you play it Rally and activate the Horn. Then we have Dunlate Crebain, Voracious Fellbeast, Torment of Golem, so like a small black spell package. And Dunlate Crebain, again, you might look at this, 3 mana, 1/1 flyer, but it's so much more than that. That can lead to slight misevaluation of the card, how powerful it is. Maybe people evaluate it through the perspective of Preening Champion and say, well, that's just worse Preening Champion. Potentially, I mean, yes, I guess it's worse Preening Champion. But the Crebain itself as a 1/1 flyer is an excellent ring bearer. So basically, opponent will have to waste the removal on the 1/1 flyer, and you still get the Amass 2 tagged onto it. And of course, Preening Champion was an A-level card. Yeah, it's okay as a common to be slightly worse than an A-level card. And yes, as the chat suggests, the Dunlate Crebain, the non-flying part of it will frequently have haste when you, instead of amassing from scratch, when you put the tokens on something that doesn't have summoning sickness and just like jam a 2/2 or a 3/3 or a 4/4 into opponent once you play it. Voracious Fellbeast, that also looks maybe a bit clunky. I definitely didn't give it like a B plus when I was evaluating it for the set, so I can imagine how that evaluation is missed, because 6 mana 4/4 flyer, especially those that follow content a lot, very often you will hear, that card is a 6 mana 4/4 flyer, and that's not the rate that I want from a 4/4 flyer. And of course, it's partially true, but you also have to look at what the card does. And Voracious Fellbeast does so much more than the usual 6 mana 4/4 flyer that this is a very good card. It's my, I really don't like the 3/2 stat line on a 3 mana creature. But I play Organ Hoarder happily, even though it costs 4 mana for the same stat line, because what it does is just so good that I'm super happy to pay for the body. Because in the end, I'm not that interested in the body, I'm interested in the effect. And Voracious Fellbeast is a great effect, and the body, 4/4 flyer is a really, really big thing in this format. Then you have the Torment of Golem. And then again, I can totally understand why this card is underappreciated by the bottom tier players. 2/2 creature that does coercion might not sound appealing, but the card and the format aligns so well. It's really good against some of the red-blue decks, especially the ones that plan on playing one big Gandalf sanction at certain stage. You can just ruin that plan by playing Torment of Golem. Lots of small things. It will snipe like big creatures and pave your way to victory. Knowledge is important. And also top tier players are going to do way better with that kind of knowledge than maybe bottom tier. So they will get additional boost from knowing how to play the card better. And we have Grishnag. That's the 1/1 that amasses 2 and then steals something that is power toughness equal or less to the amassed army's power. And importantly, doesn't steal legends. I don't know how many times I tried to steal the ring bearer, but nope. Rally at the Hornburg. Again, this doesn't look like the top red common when you look at the card list, but because making 2/1/1s may seem weak, but making 2/1/1s that have haste is way better than making 2/1/1s. So there you go. Range's Firebrand, that also looks like, it's a shock. It has Tempted by the Ring, doesn't look great. It is a great card. That Tempted by the Ring is really amazing. It deals with some quite annoying early threats as well. And can go face in those decks that operate on spell synergy, especially when you have something like, what is it? Fiery Inscription, the red enchantment. Especially when you have that, you can just go 4 into face for 1 mana, make one of my creatures unblockable because I've got Tempted by the Ring, and just jam slam and finish the game like that. Also, everything with lots of cards with Tempted by the Ring are going to be highly valued by top players, because Tempted is a very powerful mechanic in this set. Then there's Nazgul. This card is just A- level kind of quasi bomb, and I think top players understand this very, very quickly. What do we have else? Claim the Precious, Golem's Bite, Mordor Master, Shadow Summoning, and of those cards, every single thing is Rakdos except for Shadow Summoning, which is the Orzhov white black for making 2/1/1 tapped spirit tokens. A great card because it's super cheap on rate when you want to play them aggressively, and then you can do some shenanigans with sacrificing those tokens for some value. So these are the cards that top players value super highly. When we go through the difference between top and mid-tier players, so between those players that have roughly 60% win rate and 56% win rate, we see a bunch of the same cards. Eomer of the Riddermark, Torment of Gollum, Fear Fire Foes, Foray of Orcs, Voracious Felbeast, Dunlit Crebain, Nazgul, Rally of the Hornburg, Grishnak, Rangers Firebrand, Horn of Gondor, Claim the Precious. Here we also have Orcish Bowmasters, Sauron the Dark Lord, and Palantir at Orthanc. So exactly all the same cards except for 3. Palantir of Orthanc is a strange rare that does a lot of things and might seem confusingly bad, but actually is a good card. And again, top players identified it very quickly. Orcish Bowmasters, I think also, even to someone at intermediate level, like the mid-tier players, might look like it's not a bomb. It is a bomb. It is absolutely broken, and you can do so many things with that, especially in the format when drawing multiple cards in a turn is going to happen. And Orcish Bowmeisters. Someone told me that it just sounds like Cory Baumeister, and now I'm going to just call them Orcish Bowmeisters all the time. It's a 1/1 with flash that when it ETBs amasses 1 and ping something for 1. So like even like at the base level, like complete ceiling, you will be able to make 2 1/1s at instant speed for 2 mana and ping for 1. And that's the absolute like you can always go face if you can't find the target that you can kill. Like best case scenarios, you play it in response to someone drawing 2-3 cards, and then you end up with a 1/1, a 4/4, and pinging things for 4 damage as you choose. I played it in my pre-release and I cast it, and in response to the draw spell, and cast Shelob's Ambush on the Bowmasters, and then they just machine gunned half of the board all of a sudden. And that's not like once you have the Bowmasters, getting Shelob's Ambush is not difficult. So those kind of situations will happen. And all of a sudden, a game I was behind became a game I was heavily in front, and switched off my opponent's ring bearer, because every time it attacks, it just dies to the ping or whatever. And Sauron, Dark Lord, I think that this is also like something that is relatively easy to splash and powerful enough to actually warrant that splash. But what you see is that top players just pick those Rakdos cards much higher. Whether you compare them to the bottom tier players or to the mid tier players, they just pick a bunch of those really strong Rakdos cards higher. And this is the part where we go back to my preamble about drafting with preferences. It's not forcing if those 2 colors are just so much better. You actively want to be in them because that increases your chance of winning. And also, good cards are in those colors. So when you open the pack, the chance that the best card in the pack is going to be red and black is quite high. And top players realize it, and they not decide to be cute and try to draft something weird like I did to tank my win rate and explore. Okay, I did it for science. But if you are interested in winning, the best way of winning is first pick a black or a red card, because that keeps you open to multiple archetypes that are just good. You can, pick a red card and decide whether you're maybe Boros or maybe you're going to be blue-red spells. Not as easy to pivot between those two, but okay, that's fine. You can pick a black card and you can just go for like a controlling Dimir deck, or maybe you can go for the black-red, or maybe black-white, which is also a very good card combination. But if you do those first picks without deciding before you start draft, oh yeah, I'm just going to be black red because that's the best color, because that's just not smart. But if you position yourself in such a way that you're more likely to end up in those colors, that's good. And top players clearly do that, and they are winning. And it would be maybe tautological if those tiers would be only assigned based on this format. But to be in the top tier on 17 lands, you had to be consistently good across three formats. So it's not just that those top players are good because they are drafting Rakdos in Lord of the Rings. They are good because they know exactly how much preference to put on each color. Now, I think that I'm lost. Why doesn't... Okay, yeah. My slide got stuck. I think it's also interesting to see what is the difference between the mid and bottom tier players, because hopefully a lot of the people that listen to my podcast or visit my streams are people who want to improve exactly being somewhere in the middle between those tiers. Because let's face it, a bunch of people have 60% win rate, but not everyone. We're still talking about the end of the tail of the distribution. And when we look at the comparison between the mid and bottom tier players, number one card that makes a difference is Foray of Orcs. And this tells me one thing. Foray of Orcs is the card that beginner players don't value highly. Definitely not as highly as it should be. But I can totally imagine it. And I'm going to give you an anecdote from when I was starting my limited career, and that was very long ago. So the card that I couldn't get, why it's so strong, was Necrotal. If you don't remember Necrotal is a black and 2 colorless, so 4 mana for a 2/1 first strike creature where that kills a non-black creature on ETB. And I was thinking, like, that's like 4 mana. That's quite a lot for a 2/1 with first strike. I mean, yeah, I get it. It kills something, but then I'm left with that body that is not that important. Well, that body just was made more important because it killed something that would normally block it. And of course, at that time, there was also graveyard shenanigans with reanimating it and killing something else. But it took me some time to understand that those creatures are good. And I think it's a natural process. I don't want to speed up that natural process, but I want to draw attention to the players that are in those lower tiers, that Foray of Orcs, like being a 2/2 or maybe even bigger creature with partial haste that can kill something, is an amazing deal, and that's definitely worth 4 mana. Because it seems like this card is undervalued. And the same thing goes for Dunland Crabane, which is another card that is here different also between mid and bottom tiers. So it seems to me, if your win rate is around 56 on 17 lands, you understand that Dunland Crabane is good. You probably still slightly undervalue it, but you pick it relatively highly. And same, Fear Fire Foes, Bitter Downfall, Grishnak, Voracious Fellbeast, Aylmer of the Riddermark. We see the same collection of cards, and that tells me that these cards look to a beginner player like they are not as good as they are. And I think that there's really good reasons for that. One part of it is inability to evaluate the card on its own, but because all of those cards are in the same color, it's also that maybe those bottom tier players, they play in a way that does not optimize for win rate. So they will pick a green rare in their first pack and they will just draft green, when a savvy top tier 17 lens user is going to look at it and see that there's Claim the Precious in the same pack and ignore the green rare, because they understand that drafting a green rare at that stage means that you sort of commit yourself to green, and green is a bad color that you might not just see anything good anymore, because it will just turn that in this pod there was not many tree folk, for example. So because of that, they will lose that game, that draft, pretty badly, because they went for green too early rather than waiting for, reluctantly going into green in a situation when when it was wildly open and good cards were being passed to you, and you pick them speculatively at pick 6, 7, 8 rather than first picking them. So I think that this is the sort of mix that causes those differences in picking. A, not being to evaluate those particular cards correctly, but B, not evaluating, not having enough preference for black and red. And I think of interest, Horde of Gondor is also one of those cards that mid players pick higher. Again, as I said, because they probably don't treat it as a multicolor white and red card for the humans deck. Phew. So what are the cards that the bottom tier players pick way, way more frequently than the top tier players? And number one is Mithril Code. That's the 3 mana equipment that when it ETBs attaches, it has flash and it attaches to something, attaches itself to something on ETB. And that's 28 percentage points less picked by the top players. And I can see the appeal of Mithril Code to a beginning player. I said, well, it gives my creature indestructible. That must be busted. How are they going to win if my creature is not destructible? And I really love the spiel that Corticals does every single time about it. Look, if they have an indestructible bomb, and I think that he made it first time when it was talk about Thrun, the troll from, was it Brother Wars or Dominaria United? One of those two. There was this 5/5 troll that was hexproof, indestructible, whatever. And the beginner players are always, how am I going to win against that card? Well, you can kill them first. Just ignore the 3/3 indestructible, 5/5 indestructible troll, and do your job. And they either will have to leave it for blocks, and in that way, it's just not threatening you with killing you, or they will race you, and if you win, you win. So I think that this is what particularly makes Mithril Code being picked by those beginner players. They see this as like, okay, my creature is indestructible. I'm not going to win this. I'm not going to lose this game. But it turns out that you can lose quite handily when you play Mithril Code in your decks, and that's why you probably shouldn't. But if you look further down the list, we have things like Saruman of Many Colors, the One Ring, Aragorn the Uniter, Gandalf the White, Elrond Master of Healing, Fangorn Tree Shepherd, Sting the Glinting Dagger, the Watcher in the Water, Glamdring, One Ring to Rule Them All, Smeagol Helpful Guide, Samwise Gamgee, Legolas Master Archer, Storm of Saruman. All of those things are rare, and all of those things are not even just rare, they are very situational rare. Saruman of Many Colors, as the name suggests, of many colors. It's a 3 mana value creature. Aragorn, 4 different colors in it. Gandalf, very niche ability on a 4/5 flash, which basically should be treated as 4/5 flash. Elrond, a really good card in, unfortunately, the weakest archetype of the format. Watcher in the Water, probably 5 mana, do nothing for most of the game unless you have very specific build. Fangorn Tree Shepherd, it's just a massive 7 mana, 4/10 vanilla creature. One Ring, good chance that if you build a deck badly around the One Ring, it will kill you, because this is not modern where every deck has to have the One Ring playset. You want to put it in some decks, but you really, really need to have ways of sacrificing your One Ring. So, I don't know if it's a good card to be first picking, and that's probably what you have to do to get it. And, like all of those things are either very specific build around cards or cards that are in the color combinations that are not so good. When you look at the differences between top and mid-tier players, those differences are narrower. Like Mithril Code was 28 percentage points. Then you have like a bunch of cards at 20 percentage points higher picked by the bottom tier players. And then the minimum is like 16 to 14, the long tail from Fangorn to Storm of Saruman. When we look at the top versus mid players, the biggest difference is like 12 percentage points, and then you go around 10, and then you end up at 7.5 percentage points difference. So these are smaller differences. which shows you that those preferences probably are a part of the difference in the win rate. But we still have the same collection of cards. We still have Mithril Code, we still have Elrond, we have Gandalf, we have Glamdring, we have Legolas, Smeagol Helpful Guide, Aragorn, One Ring to Rule Them All, and there are a bunch of other things, but all of them are also rares and mythics. So I think that this is like one tendency of people that begin to play the game and begin to play the limited. They are reading what wizards print on the card. So Elrond, rare. Well, it must be busted then. It's a rare. Mithril Code, that's a rare equipment. Must be busted. Same with Glamdring. And they're not necessarily good cards that are rares in limited. Especially in this set, the bunch of rares are not that great. Or force you to do deck choices that you rather not take, especially early. Like, Shelob is definitely a good card. It's just that if you pick it, you probably either need to splash it, and then you need to dedicate part of your draft to splashing it, or you need to play green. And the success of the top player says, well, you probably don't want to play green. You want to play black, and you want to play red. And Shelob only fulfills half of those criteria. So yeah, I think that there is this tendency of trying to play rares. It might be honestly has something to do with rare drafting and the top players being tryhards. They will go, well, I'm gonna pick that good uncommon over that rare because whatever. And especially when you play 100 drafts in a format, yes, you're gonna get that rare sooner or later from the packs you open. So maybe there is no worries there. And if you don't, then you can just always craft it from your 700 wildcards that you accumulated over time. Okay. So yeah, generally top players are not that keen on middle rares that require you to make those kind of weird deck building choices. And the biggest differences between mid and bottom tier players, well, we start with the One Ring, Saruman, Mithril Code. We still get the same collection of Gandalf, Aragorn, Samwise. So you can see that this is a process of weaning off that land rare drafting kind of thing. Because we see the same cards that mid players were drafting more aggressively than the top players. We see that bottom players draft them more aggressively than the mid players. So we will see that lots of those cards are going to be like a process of learning that that rare is probably just not good enough. I'd rather pick a common uncommon. Yeah, too many of those cards are the same, so I'm just not gonna look at them in more detail. So for the differences in the play rate, these will not be that many rares. These are the differences between when you pick a card, how often do you put them in your deck? And obviously, if you pick those rares, most of the time people will try to put them in your deck as well. So we won't see many of those in this part. But what we see is a bunch of solid commons that top players put in their deck more frequently when they pick them, and bottom tier players don't put them. And again, there can be two reasons. One reason might be that they don't evaluate a particular card highly enough, so they draft them, but then they don't put them in their deck, even though they are playing the colors. And that's the problem of card evaluation. But the other problem might be that they pick those cards, but later don't play those colors. And of course, I can't tell you which one is which, but I can surely guess that in case of Torment of Gollum, it's probably a combination of both in pretty even situation. But when we look at a card like Barad-dûr, it's probably because the player was pushed out of a particular color combination. So when we look at those, Torment of Gollum, top players put it 18 percentage points more frequently than the bottom players. And I can actually try to maybe look at to give you like the impression of how often what do those numbers mean. I just need to go through my magic Excel sheet and sort it properly. Top play rate. Where is it? Okay. So tournament of Gollum, bottom tier players will play it roughly 60% of the time when they draft it. Top players 79% of the time. So that's basically the difference. So at least part of it must be being pushed out of the colors. And I would love to make that analysis when the draft data gets out. It's not going to be easy. When you look at the Shellop's ambush, 46% play rate when it's picked by the bottom tier players and 61% by the top players. Here, I think that a lot of it is that Shellop's ambush is going to be cut even from the black decks by the lower win rate players. And which other cards do we have on that list? We have Sam's Desperate Rescue, another black card that that I think maybe does not appeal because like 1 mana to get something out of your graveyard doesn't seem super good. But Tempted by the Ring is a very important part. We have a bunch. We have a couple of rares. We have Flowering of the White Tree, Moria Marauder, and Frodo Sauron's Bane. Another card that I think is like really the whole archetype of blue-red spells is much more friendly towards good players, which also makes you think about it's a difficult archetype to play, therefore it's played more by the top players, therefore it might have an elevated win rate because of the group of players that plays it. We have Relentless Rohirrim, we have Isolation at Orthanc, the 4 mana. The 4 mana put something second from the top of the library of the owner. And that type of card is always played more by the top players. In any iteration that I've seen, that card was always on the part of the biggest difference between top and bottom tier players as top players play it more, basically. Quarrel's End, that's another card that gets probably cut from many decks of the lower win rate players, and Murder Master. These are very similar. So sort of like you pay 2-3 mana, you get a 1/1, but you also get some card draw / selection. And top players love drawing cards. And bottom tier players probably see it as like, oh, it's just a 1/1 with for 2 mana. That doesn't seem good. And in the other direction, which cards are beloved by the bottom tier players and not so much by the top tier players? Entish Restoration. I think that this card has like a lot of appeal to a less experienced player. They say, well, I can ramp my mana. And that's very often ramping to nothing and ending up with like 5-color soups that are not going to work. That's not to say that you can't draft those decks. It's just that those decks are super hard to get and super hard to play and super hard to identify where you should be in that type of deck. And this is something that you learn over time. And the bottom tier players are going to disproportionately lose more games when they try to play those strategies. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't, because you won't learn if you don't try. But they should know that by subscribing to the 5-color strategy, they're probably throwing away win rate there. Nimrod the Watcher, that's the Scry 2/1. Again, not played so much by the top players. And again, probably exacerbating the scale of the problem with green-blue, because it's a appealing archetype for the lower win rate players, and at the same time very not appealing for top win rate players because they like to win and that archetype doesn't win. And because of that, probably the difference between Rakdos win rate and the Simic win rate, when you want to normalize for all the confounding factors, that difference will be smaller than what currently is 11-12 percentage points. Not by much, but by some. It will be not 12 but maybe 10, because of how much more data you get from bottom tier players on that archetype and how much less data you get from top tier players on that archetype. What else do we have here? Greyhaven's Navigator, that's the same problem. It's in the Scry deck. Knights of Dol Amroth, that's in the Draw 2 deck, which also is not something that really exists. Shire Terrace, that's the version of Evolving Wilds for this format, and well, clearly it's not as good as Evolving Wilds, and definitely it's like, I would play it maybe if I splash for Sauron or something like that, or splash for Shelob in my black white deck or something. But I won't put it in my 2-color decks, and I am playing Evolving Wilds quite a lot in my 2-color decks if I don't have like many 1-drops. So I think that people still evaluate as if it was Evolving Wilds when it's not, and put it in the decks that they shouldn't be. And I would assume that also top players speculate on picking it because they like to have that option when they, like pack 1, you see a late Shire Terrace, you pick it just because it keeps you open if you open a bomb in like pack 2s and 3. But then, of course, they never go into the deck, and in case of bottom tier players, will sometimes go in the deck, and that's those small differences that make a difference between tiers. If Trebuchet is there, then clearly Mirkwood Bats is also there. 2 cards that should be played. I'm getting closer and closer to say that they shouldn't be played at all. But I mean, obviously, there will be some decks where both Mordor Trebuchet and Mirkwood Bats are going to be excellent, and probably it's going to be the same type of deck. Probably not the ones with Amass, but maybe like black red or black white with generation of the 1/1 humans and maybe some food and stuff. Would we have Guai here, the Windlord? That's probably just because it's not that great color combination. It's not going to get played. Glorfindel, that's also not an impressive card. Captain of Umbar, the 3-mana 2/3 that can loot for some mana. It's just not on rate. We have Surrounded by the Orcs again, the Amass 3 mill something, and Galadrim Guide. All those cards are just like very meh, and I just will rather splash something than to play them in my deck. But the bottom tier players will just put them, and that's another thing that I observed in paper, that beginner players very often end up with those like 17th to 23rd cards in their decks are close to unplayable, and that's a mixture of, in my opinion, that's a mixture of bad card evaluation but also of bad draft navigation when you're sort of forced to play those cards. And I can't tell from this data which one it is, but I think that in case of things like Surrounded by Orcs, it might be card evaluation. But in terms of like cards like Captain of Amber, it might be sort of necessity of playing those cards because you just don't get enough. You don't get enough playables for your deck because you did some evaluation errors maybe, and maybe you also dirtle in the draft too much and try to find that lane, but because you're not like super experienced, you didn't do it for decades every day and think about it every waking moment of your life. Because of that, you're obviously not going to be as good in navigating as someone who does, and there's absolutely no shame in that. But I mean, this is the moment to realize that, okay, I have an issue with draft navigation, and I'm not doing any coaching, but I'm sometimes chatting with players in my LGS that have that problem, that they have really good basic deck of 17 cards that is like strong, coherent and everything, and then I look at like last 6 cards and it's just like nothing in there, and then I look through their sideboard and there's like 8 solid cards in another color that just can't make a deck either way or other, but they were picked in there, and because of that there was just not enough picks to make a cohesive deck. So I'm not saying that you should like marry to your first pick, but there is a good reason why 80% of the time the first pick does end up in your deck. Yeah, they are cards that are played more frequently by the bottom tier. Yeah. All right, when that ends the play rate outliers, I didn't do them for the other ones because I thought it would be just never-ending list of cards. So I have more cards, but this time we're looking at the game in hand win rate. So I looked at the cards that are disproportionately higher or lower win rate between top and bottom players. And that's just something to think, like, why are those cards there? So the difference between top and bottom tiers is roughly 10 percentage points. So if one card has a 20 percentage point game and win rate difference, like Moria Marauder has, that means that there is something about that card that requires extra skill in playing this card. And I'm not going to tell you which skill it is, but I just want you to realize that some of those cards are just going to be slightly trickier to play. It might be that top players just play the card in an excellent fashion, and it might be that bottom players play this card really badly because it's like has some kind of a natural trap. And which cards do we have? Moria Marauder is the 1/1 double striker when Orc or Goblin, I hope, deals combat damage to an opponent. You exile the top card of the library. You may pay it till the end of turn. That's a game in hand win rate difference between top players and bottom players. So that's in percentage points. So I think Moria Marauder requires you to design your attacks in such a way that you both can connect and at the same time that you still have mana left to cast whatever you revealed. And there will be small edges with that, like whether you play the land too soon and waste a draw step. So yeah, there's a lot to think about that card. And I think that this one is particularly prone to gameplay kind of prowess. Same goes for Bath Song. And that's the saga that makes you draw to discard twice, and then you can shuffle cards in your library, and you get some mana, and then you can spend that mana on stuff. The problem with this card is that, especially in the last chapter, to shuffle or not to shuffle is a difficult decision, and maybe beginner players will tend to err on the side of always shuffling everything or shuffling nothing. And yeah, every time you have cards with that much choice, it will very much favor the top players. Like I played against a white or blue-red spells deck, but not sort of aggressive, but a very controlling one. And it was like a never-ending game. And then they played this Bath Song and filtered through basically almost end of their library. And then chapter 3 hit, and they shuffled nothing. And I'm like, oh, I guess I'm dead. I was at 27 life at that time. And I had some board. And I just realized at that moment, I'm dead. They didn't shuffle anything. Because, of course, for me, it means that's a good player. We had a chat later, and then they were very friendly about beating the living life out of me. That means that they want to keep spells in their graveyard, which means that they have Gandalf Sanction or 2. And it turns out that the next turn they just Gandalf sanctioned a 1/1, Gandalf sanctioned another 1/1, and I was all of a sudden from 27, I was at -2. So yeah, that was an example of an excellent play. But maybe a less experienced player would go for the temptation of shuffling some stuff, and they would be just short of killing me because of that. Then you have Flame of Honor. That's another card that offers you choice. And again, cards that offer choice are the cards that are going to promote top players because they just make better choices because of experience and how much they play with stuff. Samwise, again, another card that offers choice when to play it. And the same goes with Lobelia Sackville Baggins. 2 creatures with haste that require something to die to get an extra effect, but also are perfectly playable as an ambush or as just play it at the end of the turn and slam with it next turn. And that choice, again, is proving to be promoting good players. Rangers of Ithilien, that might be the case of protecting them after you cast them because they steal something. And if they don't die, you are in a good position because you keep their creature. And maybe you want to force quickly to trade off that creature that you stole so that you will not cry after they kill the Rangers of Ithilien because they did their job. So all those things are going to be uh, quite difficult and finicky in terms of playing around stuff and knowing what to play around. And I think that again that boosts the win rate. Pelargir Survivor, Birthday Escape, Treason of Isengard, Fire Inscription, Arwen's Gift, and Gandalf, Friend of the Shire. And these are sort of all elements of some sort of blue spells deck. Well, maybe Gandalf is playable in multiple shells, but it can be really good in those Birthday Escape decks when you can actually get some extra ring bearers, draw some extra cards out of your stuff. All this package is sort of like the package that you want to have in spells decks, which means again that I think that the top players play those spells decks much better, because spells is not a common strategy. Even if you played limited for several formats, you might have focused on playing creature decks, and rightfully so, because as a beginner you should probably focus on those kind of aggressive creature strategies, because they offer you the best chance of winning, and you can catch up with other stuff once you master the aggro. And because of that, I think that bottom tier players do slightly worse in those spell matters decks, because they require good sequencing of spell, planning ahead by a couple of turns, and that's not an easy part of the game. When we look at the lowest differences between the top and the bottom players, Aragorn and Celeborn, for some reason, have almost no difference between top players and bottom players. I mean, there is a reason. Aragorn is just not good in the hands of the top players, but bottom players are actually doing fine with it for some reason. They win more with Aragorn than with most cards, and this might be due to small sample size, really. So I'm not going to put too much thought about it. What cards are in the same gist? Friendly Rivalry is another card that just does okay in the hands of the bottom players, not so great in the hands of top players. What I'm more interested in this graph is cards like Shadowfax, Lord of Horses, cards that do well with good players, but also do well with the bottom tier players. That to me means that it's a relatively easy and yet powerful card. And when you're in the beginner tier, you want to play those type of cards, and you have like Book of Mazarbul, or that is in similar gist, a good card that also is good when you're a beginner player, because it sort of puts you on rails what to do. It doesn't require too many choices, and you can just win. Again, Eowyn, Fearless Knight, Eomer, Marshal Rohan, those kind of cards do work pretty well with the bottom tier players, not even though, and they do pretty well with the top players, but maybe not as the difference is not as big. And one card that is interesting on that list is Reprieve. This is a 2-mana, put a spell that an opponent casts back into their hand, draw a card. And I was expecting that this is going to be a finicky card that will promote the top players, but actually the difference is not so big. So interesting to see Reprieve on that list. Differences between top and mid players. The biggest one is Prince Imrahil the Fair. That's the 2-mana 2/2. When you draw a second card each turn, you get a 1/1. I guess that it's going to be played by the top players in conjunction with maybe Faramir, or that you have to have really good reason to play white-blue, or is it going to be splashed in some colors where it's easy to splash? And also, I'm pretty sure that top players, when they play Imrahil, they will try to accrue the 1/1 instantly, and that way, they always pay for a decent deal of 2/2 and a 1/1, rather than paying for a 2/2 and then not being able to capitalize for several turns and then it dying to something. Another card that I wanted to look at is Breaking of the Fellowship. That's the 2-mana. Target creature an opponent controls deals damage to another target creature that an opponent controls, and the ring tempts you. This card has pretty poor win rate in mid tier and very bad win rate in bottom tier, but quite a high win rate in top tier players. So I think that they can utilize the being tempted by the ring more efficiently, and that's the reason why this card is so high in their hands. And also they will be able to plan around how to use the breaking of the fellowship most efficiently. My favorite card to deal with this card is Gothmog. Was it Gothmog? I think so. The 3/3 that amasses one, and your token creatures get death touch, because you can just kill it with your death touching token, and then the token stops being having death touch, which is a lovely thing to do. What else do we have here that is interesting? Again, we have Pelargir Survivor. That's the spells mana dork. And we have Hitlane Knots, and I think excellent card in this format that that does require some good skills on how to play it, because it tops a creature and you draw a card. When to use it, when not to use it to maximize the effect is an interesting one. In terms of the win rate difference in advantage of the mid-tier players, there is one really big outlier, and that's You Cannot Pass. Card has a pretty bad win rate in top players, but I think that in that case it's due to it ending up in weird multicolor legend-based concoctions that just don't have a good win rate, while mid players are just going to play it in sort of like more streamlined deck that has multiple legends just happens in the same color. What other interesting cards? Entity Restoration we talked about. There was lots of those cards are just really good cards on rate. We have Eomer, Marshal of Rohan. We have Delighted Halfling. It's hard to go wrong with those cards, you know. And we have Faramir, Prince of Ithilien. That's another one that is a good card, but it also does good for the mid-tier, because the sheer power level of the card is insane. And the differences between middle tier players and the bottom players, we again see the Moria Marauder. So it seems Moria Marauder is, particularly when you're a beginner, you have problems playing with that card. When you're in the mid-tier, you're fine playing it. So it's not like the most advanced card on the planet, but yeah. I have a question from chat. Does Many Parting suggest top players are better at splashing? Top players are better at splashing, but that data doesn't necessarily suggest it. I did look, however, on the stats on splashing, and yeah, top players are just slightly better in how they. I'm trying to find that data very hastily and in my 17 lands. So mid-tier players have a 57.5% win rate in two-color decks, with 62% for two-color decks by the top players. So that's 5 percentage points roughly difference, 4.8. And in two-color decks with a splash, it's 52.2 versus 57.5. So the difference is really small. It's like 4.8 versus 5.5 difference between two-color and splash. So they are better than splashing, but not by much. 3.4. Yeah, that's basically the answer to your question. Arstal, if you go back after this, I had a whole collection of slides that were that was showing. I'm actually go after I'm finished in a second. I might go back to those slides to show you what exactly I told about landcyclers, because I had a whole section about it. Right. So the difference between mid and bottom. Moria Murder again, Delighted Halfling, another card that is sort of like mid-skill level card, and it does very well for mid players, but really not so well for the bottom. Lobelia Sackville Baggins, that was also on the previous list. We have Bag and Porter. I don't know what to do from it, but Bath Song is another thing that is a sort of mid skill level card, and we see the bunch of the same things: Flame of Honor, Rangers of Ithilien. All those cards are mid players can do well with those cards, while the bottom tier players can't. So that's the sort of level up that you are going to have to experience. And the cards that do pretty decently with bottom tier players compared to mid tier players, we have Friendly Rivalry again. The bottom tier players actually do better with that card than top tier players. Then we have like a bunch of really strong bombs like Shelob, Aragorn Company Leader. These cards do more or less the same in the hands of the mid and bottom tier players. Faramir, Horn of Gondor, all those cards are close between those two tiers, and that's just strictly on the power level of those cards. And again, Reprieve, for some reason, does really, really well in the bottom tier level, and I have no explanation for that, but I definitely do note that it's this ability, this thing is there. But okay, I'm drained. It's midnight, so I'm going to thank the 17 Lands team, Viral Misnomer, Hululu, Grant, ZTM, for generating this amazing resource that we all can use. I'd like to thank Fake Jake Brown for helping me with releasing this as a podcast. Once we're talking about the podcast, I would like to thank Asescu and Mana Junkie for the music that we're using in the podcast. And of course, I'd like to thank mtgazone.com for sponsoring me. And I would like to thank my patrons, and especially Sam, who is a new patron. And if you like to receive such thanks, then the Patreon is there. Just click it. It's very easy. But with that, I'll see you next week when we hopefully talk about some other interesting topics linked to Lord of the Rings. See you next week.